see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Thanks, Kris, for joining me here in this dialogue on how we can build a culture of empathy. Are you in your offices now at the Restorative Justice Center there?
I am. This is where I do my work. I'm part of in between a hallway where we have staff up front that greet people, and then our room where we do circles in the back.
Oh, great. Well, can you just introduce yourself a little bit? I know I looked at your website and it said you're a professor of psychology and anthropology and criminal justice. Is that something you're still doing, or?
That's the department that I teach in. So at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, I teach a class in restorative justice. It's a special topics class, and we have criminal justice as a minor offered at University of Wisconsin River Falls. So I do that in addition to the full-time work as executive director here at St. Croix Valley Restorative Justice.
Well, I also have your web page up. So you're at Kris N. Minor on Facebook.
Yes.
And then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. I love Facebook and the social media and blogging, and so we have our Restorative Justice site on Facebook for our local nonprofit as well as my page.
Yeah, and then I see you've got a blog too at circle-space.org.
Yes, I've been doing that since 2008. I really wanted to get the message out to people, kind of be on the cutting edge of blogging for restorative justice. And I love talking about aspects of circle keeping or doing restorative justice or providing examples of how we use it. I've really found writing to be something fun, and I like the style of offering blogging.
Yeah, and then I see, I'm just kind of going through your pages here that you have. There's 4 of them that I've seen, and then there's the Restorative Justice Center where you're working. How do you pronounce that? St. Crux? Or?
St. Croix.
Oh, Croix.
St. Croix Valley. Yeah. So we started the nonprofit literally from the ground up, and I think we could have come up with a better name when we look back, because St. Croix Valley describes where we live, and restorative justice is what we do. So the St. Croix Valley Restorative Justice Program Incorporated is our 501c3. So
and you're the you're the executive director over there. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. That's my role, and write grants, facilitate sessions, train volunteers, take out the garbage when needed.
Kind of keep the whole place running, and it's that you're like running it and also doing the circle processes. It sounds like so you're doing pretty much everything, some of everything.
Yep. We started, and wherever I was kind of the office. I had a small stipend for my cell phone. We'd hold our sessions at churches or libraries, and in 2006 we opened the Restorative Justice Center. So we actually got to have our shingle out, and that helped us get more involved in the community.
Yeah, and that is it. Let's see, that's it. What's the URL there?
SCVRJP for St. Croix Valley Restorative Justice Program.
And then you have a Facebook page as well for the center there.
Yes, we try to link out to interesting articles around the world about restorative justice, create some conversation around restorative justice on college campuses, in schools, just kind of feed people a constant thought stream about restorative justice.
So it sounds like your life kind of revolves around this.
Yeah, that would be pretty clear. When I went to my class reunion a couple of years ago, people were talking about Facebook, and they're like, geez, would you cut it out with restorative justice stuff? So I figured that must mean my life's around it. Well,
as you know, the work I'm doing at the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy is around how do we build a culture of empathy. And before you and I had talked about doing this interview, I said, well, how do we build a culture of empathy? And I think you'd said restorative justice builds empathy. So one way of building a culture of empathy is more restorative justice. So what are you seeing is how do we go about building a culture that has more empathy in everywhere, worldwide?
Yeah, what I appreciate about a culture of empathy is that restorative justice also looks at that empathy as a value. And I think restorative justice is based on values. So it is about focusing on a cultural change. So I appreciate that language about it specifically, because I think culture is how we live, how we relate to each other, how someone that enters into our community would get a sense of connection to us. So to me, I see restorative justice and culture of empathy really interrelated. And restorative justice is an overall view of crime and conflict. And our particular logo has the 3 swirls, and that is not only for victim, offender, and community, but also some specific outcomes. And one of the outcomes is to improve empathy, restore connections, improve empathy, and increase self-worth are kind of our outcomes from our restorative justice program.
So you're kind of, that's actually how I kind of came across your work. I think you did an article called Restorative Justice Provides a Context to Increase Empathy.
Yeah, where I see the restorative justice that we do here at St. Croix Valley Restorative Justice is so much in the circle process. And what the circle does is it really helps us slow down. And even though we're doing the same things that we do consistently, speaking and listening, we do it different in circle because we're using the talking piece. We're identifying our values right away up front. We're committed to this way of relating to each other with the talking piece. And then what happens when we just take a minute to slow down and do listening that's different, listening just for understanding, instead of listening for where I can jump in and agree with you, or listening until I find where we disagree. It's just listening without judgment and listening for understanding. And then the speaking is different when we ask people to speak from the heart. That's not what you think about somebody else, but that's relating your own experiences. And oftentimes in circle, I've had feedback from young people, or I've seen it happen. A person will start to talk, and in that strong container of values in circle, they start to talk and they start to express things. One student said, I talked about things about myself that I didn't even know until I was saying them. And so that kind of deep from the heart sharing creates empathy, because I believe we all have that inner humanity piece. And so that's where I think the empathy happens, because you see so much of yourself in another person in circle.
Yeah, so it sounds like to build a culture of empathy, one of the ways of doing it is to slow down. You know, it's like we go so fast and we're so caught up in what we have to do that we don't have the time and space to kind of make that connection with others, maybe.
Right, and I think sometimes we hold judgments about ourselves and about others. And in the circle process, we're identifying values right away. We're making a commitment to relate to each other with things that we've all contributed: trust, honesty, respect. And we don't usually engage with people right away with the thought of, okay, these are the values that we're going to relate to. And so I say it makes me manically optimistic about people, is usually the first thing I get to hear about them is their values. And so you could see someone and you might think of, I try not to be judgmental, but depending on their dress or their gender, you do have, their age, you do develop certain things. But then you hear a young person talk about, the value they wrote on their plate is honesty, and they're talking about how much their family is honest with them. And you realize that it's innate inside of us to understand these values.
So you're saying that connecting to people's values is kind of like a way of developing empathy, or how does that kind of relate with people's values?
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about building that culture of slowing down, it is taking the time to slow down and just kind of catch a breath and allow the space for you to be you without judgment, and for me to be me. And then that's where empathy can uphold, because I'm not thinking, I'm not racing through my head thinking, do I trust this person? Can I share with him? What do I think he wants me to say about this? The circle process and restorative justice just connects people to a humanity. What's amazing, I think, about restorative justice, too, when it comes to empathy, is I think that crime and conflict is usually the place where you think you wouldn't find empathy. And what happens in a talking circle, when we introduce people to each other, we talk about these values, we make a commitment to have our discussion within these values, And then it's amazing how empathy comes from the person who you would least expect it, usually the victim of a particular crime, or how much an offender suddenly has empathy for what they did because they're hearing it from someone else, like a bystander they might not have considered. Or, I don't know, a case story kind of comes to mind. There were some teenage boys, or maybe pre-adolescent is a better description, and their parents had given them the money to go to the movie, and they saw each other outside, and they thought, hey, maybe we won't go to the movie. What could we use this money for? That they, their parents, they basically had unsupervised time because they collected outside the theater, and somebody had seen on a YouTube that you could blow up a can of deodorant by somehow lighting it on fire or something. So they walked down to the grocery store. They even told the clerk what they were planning on doing. They thought it would be funny. Oh, sorry. And then when the can kind of exploded, the deodorant exploded or started on fire, a local business had to come out and put water on it. Someone called the police. And when we did restorative justice, and the police officer was there explaining that since 9/11, when you get a call about an explosion, all kinds of things come up in your mind. When you have to rush to a scene and drive with lights and sirens, you have concern for the safety of bystanders, like always how a police officer worries about going there. It was just interesting to see how obviously empathy happened because the students knew that person's story.
Well, how are you defining empathy? Because we're talking about empathy, and it's like there's a lot of different ways people define it. I was just wondering, how are you defining it?
I think empathy is more understanding about the other person, but I think then there's the other part that, like, I see myself in you. Like, I understand your perspective differently. When I talk about teaching empathy, I talk about it that you have to teach listening. Because when we really listen to other people, we hear things in them that we can realize for ourselves. Or we can say, oh, I don't realize that. I don't like green beans, and you do like green beans. And that's kind of, we just had one of the getting acquainted questions we use in circles, like, what did you have for supper? And if you could have anything, what would it be? And you get to hear from people in your community, people that are coming together to do the process, that they ate, beefaroni, and they've been on a kick of eating beefaroni for a while. And some of the college students were laughing, and here's our community volunteer in their 50s having a beefaroni. And you could see that it connected people by that understanding of common experience.
So in the situation with the young boys who were blowing up the can, and I was at that age too at one point, and I blew up cans too, so I can kind of empathize with them. It's a lot of fun. We used to take pipes and put match heads into them and shoot them off, and then we'd kind of create little pipe bombs and do all kinds of stuff like that. It was quite entertaining, so I can kind of empathize with their situation. But the empathy in that situation would be the boys were seeing how their actions affected the police officer, for example, that he had to be all concerned and worried because of 9/11. So they were feeling that stress and that concern, as well as they were feeling maybe the stress and concern of the shopkeeper who had to come out and perhaps bystanders. But then those people too had to maybe empathize with the fun the kids were having too. Maybe they were being creative. They could be future scientists or rocket scientists or something.
Yeah, and that is exactly what happened, because who didn't like to blow up stuff, but what they had to learn was that because the business person, from their point of view, was customers come to my establishment, and if this would have splashed onto their cars or done damage, it could have affected my business. And he had his own particular story. But yeah, that's exactly what happened. Because the police were called and because tickets were issued, the parents were awfully shamed. And so there was empathy when the kids got to hear from other people's parents how they were impacted. And then our community members had that empathy and were able to say, you're not bad parents. These aren't bad kids. They were completely reintegrated into the community with that aspect. of empathy. So that's how I think it works in restorative justice.
Well, how does that compare? We have in society, perhaps we could see two, at least I see two very distinct approaches to crime and conflict. One being retributive justice, which is those, there's a set of rules, you know, don't blow up things or whatever. And it's like, if they transgress that rule, you get the book thrown at you, you get punished, you get thrown in juvenile hall, and you suffer, right? And then the other method is actually, I mean, you're calling it restorative justice. I personally call it restorative empathy, because for me it's the, you know, it's about creating connection and creating deeper connection. So, and I kind of see those as two kind of poles, and they might kind of merge and overlap, you know, in the middle, so you have a variation of the two. So I was just wondering how that kind of resonates. So we're kind of like, you know, zooming out a little bit about the nature of restorative justice and retributive justice.
Yeah, in the early, Howard Zier, grandfather of restorative justice, he's kind of nicknamed.
Oh, before we start, your image just froze. I'm going to stop my video camera in the hope that it gives a bit more bandwidth. And if you could stop and start your camera again, I think that sometimes gets it started again. Yeah, there we go.
How's that?
Great.
Okay.
So you were saying about the Howard something.
That, yeah, in the 70s, it was seen as like two different systems, like two ends of the spectrum. But now it's seen that there are times that people need a timeout, and that restorative justice can be used along this continuum. You know, a case where a murder, loss of life occurs. And I just put on Facebook a couple days ago, a woman met with her rapist and did restorative justice. So it can be on the most serious of crime and incidents that, you know, people do need that, you know, punishment piece, all the way down to, you know, a third grade classroom where someone is breaking everybody, you know, they're breaking one student's pencils all the time, and it becomes this thing where everybody, it's a joke in the class, let's all break Billy's pencils. And maybe Billy is from a family that doesn't have, you know, pencils aren't easy to come by. So you can do what seems really simple, but it's not, because you have to take it into context. And I think that's, you know, part of empathy is considering everybody else's context. And then certainly the empathy that happens when you hear someone's story so deeply that you understand walking in their shoes.
So I wasn't quite clear on that. You're saying that there used to be like a sense of a continuum between a punitive and restorative justice, and you're saying that's not the view now, or?
Yeah, it's not that they should just be completely like either or.
Oh,
But how do we integrate restorative justice even when we need, you know, could we even have it in the prison system as a way of how we relate to people? Is there a way to integrate restorative values along a continuum rather than just saying these are two distinctly opposite things and we have to do it all this way or all this way?
Oh, I see. Yeah, so you can have a merging of the two processes, punitive and restorative, and
and I think the for me, in my experience with working with the punitive system, has given me some tools that I kind of use. Like I make it like a little lighthearted when I talk with people, and I say, you know, I usually start with when a little kid eats the cupcake and they have frosting on their lip, and you ask them, did you eat that cupcake? And they'll say no, and the fear of getting in trouble overrides that value of telling the truth. So when you're in a climate or a culture that what I tell you is going to get me in trouble, you withhold. You don't always tell that. So sometimes I'll talk about that. And you can see like the kids who the school has it on camera that they got in a fight and they're like, I didn't do it. And yet here's the video that it was you. I explain that to the kids and you can kind of see like a little smile on their face so they kind of understand it. So I pave the way. And sometimes I even say, this isn't anything you say will be held against you, but this is confession is good for the soul. So I usually do make the distinctions that restorative justice is about the social emotional aspect, and that's what we want to deal with, and that's, you know, the things that we get at a change of behavior by a change of heart in restorative justice.
Well, we have a local mediation center here that I've done their mediation training, and they do restorative justice workshops. And I've talked with people there, and for me, it's like, justice has the metaphor of the scale, right? There's the Lady Justice, and it's this idea that you've done me harm, and now you need to be harmed to equalize the scale. So kind of inherent in justice is kind of that notion of equalization of kind of acts, whereas with empathy, it's about standing in someone else's shoes. There's a quality of going into their experience. We're talking about the definition, and for me, one of the definitions is to see the other person, but to keep seeing more deeply into the other person. So I guess I've kind of been promoting, well, it's not really restorative justice, it's restorative empathy that this is about. You know what I mean? It's like empathy is kind of like put in, is kind of like a part of the process, where really, to me, the real restorative justice is really about a more accurate term might be restorative empathy. So I'm just wondering what you kind of think about that.
Yeah, I think that could be accurate, because what you're hoping for is healing, and I think that anytime we have empathy with ourselves inwardly or outwardly, that helps. That empathy and healing to me is part of that restorative justice. I don't think you can have accountability, which is another kind of pillar of restorative justice, without realizing the harm that you caused. Acknowledging you caused the harm, to me, is a little bit of understanding, being, having that empathy about what it is. So yeah, I agree. Maybe the restorative empathy would be a better term, or maybe 30 years ago, or however long ago the movement started, it might have been a stronger selection.
Yeah, and the reason I'm interested in the empathy part, because the justice tends to be, okay, some harm, something has happened. But with empathy, it's kind of seeing that even before we get to those conflicts, if we have a framework where empathy is a social value, and that we're kind of like promoting it, so it's kind of like it's like heading off the problems before they occur, and creating a context for that, saying, well, what can we do to have people be more aware of empathy and how empathy works, and be kind of filling everyone's empathy batteries, before the empathy battery is so low that people start punching each other.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a lot of the reason that restorative justice, kind of coming out of the criminal justice system, then the schools have picked it up and they call it restorative practices or restorative measures, and for the same reason, that kind of that tone on the word justice. I like to talk about that restorative justice basically has, she takes off her blindfold and puts down the scales and sits in circle with people, because you see what's happening, and you've put aside, the scales could be used, but only as a talking piece in restorative justice. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, that's a nice metaphor. Lady Justice sits down into a circle process and says, what's going on for you, and why is this going on, and what's going on for you. Lady Justice becomes becomes the circle keeper.
Yeah, I've been wanting to figure out how I could dress like that for Halloween or something, because that blindfold, though, that's the only part that, So, I don't know, it's interesting that we picked that someone blindfolded, because it's, to me, we're not seeing people, or what that is about that justice. To be fair, you can't really look at it. That's a whole different kind of conversation, I guess.
So we're talking about the building a culture of empathy, in conflict. So are there ideas around that? It's like, it's the restorative justice process, the circle, bringing people in the circle to dialogue with each other is a way of deepening that empathic connection. Kind of other ideas around that?
Well, I'd like to just go back and kind of underline what you were saying about, if there's that culture and we are more empathetic towards people, then those conflicts wouldn't happen. Our mission statement here is a culture of peace and belonging. And peace is not just the absence of violence where someone wouldn't hit or punch or slap you, but that violence is anything that it violates the integrity of another person. So, you know, if I was to write bad things about you on Facebook, that's viewed as something that's a violation of peace. So I think that people behave harmfully, they act violently for some sort of justification in their head. Sometimes it's a justification for them, but in the broader community, it's, you know, maybe you key a car because you think rich people can afford it. You know, especially with teenagers, they have conflict between each other from perceptions of what they think. But if we did have our empathy cup filled and we assumed the best about people, or we maybe thought about others before we thought about ourselves, then I think that would reduce those harmful acts towards each other, because we wouldn't have that perception of trying to right the wrong that we perceive.
Well, that's the complicated part about the justice, is that if we know that people need, I mean, especially kids growing up, need to be heard, seen, and felt as part of their nurture and growing and development process, and society is not offering that. It's saying, no, you have no worth, you know, you're poor, you're from a poor family, we're going to shun you, we're going to kind of ostracize you, you're not, you know, part. And then, so there is like that's kind of that shunning is kind of like is not empathic, it's actually a form of violence. So, you know, we start getting into, you know, it's like people are doing these acts of violence or, you know, of harm, but it's like there's a whole chain reaction of harms going, you know, I mean, it becomes so complicated, you don't know where it starts and where it ends. So.
Right, right. And that's why I think it's important to say, let's do this in a cultural context. And that's the thing too, is teaching that, you know, that violence begets violence, that's what you're talking about, that I'm going to harm you because you harmed me. And, you know, I've heard it described with communities, you know, you wrecked my flowers, I'm going to hurt your cat, you hurt my cat, I'm going to hurt your child, and eventually wars break out, you know. I don't know what the answer is on the bigger picture, but I'm passionate about what we're doing here in trying to do things, and I'm very, very energized by the number of schools that call me to help come and do this in the schools. The circle itself can be done at a community level just to connect kids to each other before something happens, at kind of an at-risk level, like we know something might happen that's going to violate the rules of the school. One thing that we know, that people that are low on empathy are sometimes those that experience neglect in their background, can create that. So you can do it community-wide to build the culture when something's at risk, and then also the top of the pyramid, the primary, secondary, and tertiary is when there has been a harm. So I'm manically optimistic, not only about people, but about changing our structures within our educational system that are recognizing that kids need relationships to learn, and that they need to feel safe on the inside to have any information or learning happen.
Well, that's what I'm excited about the whole restorative process, is because it's a real nuts and bolts process, a real structure, a structural way that can be implemented, you know, and brought into any school, any environment. And I know that, for example, I've heard that New Zealand has implemented in their juvenile, replaced their juvenile court systems, you know, nationwide, for example.
Yeah, that's exciting that the first place to try and solve the issue is within the community. And then if that doesn't work, then they use the system instead of defaulting right into the system. Yeah, I don't know, the really understanding people is just so strong and has such an impact, and we use storytelling for that in the program, and I just feel very blessed to get to work in this context and see this work kind of happen. So I think it's great that, you know, even like your show at the very beginning where you have the recording of Obama talking about empathy.
Yeah, so you're just talking about your personal experience. How did you personally develop kind of this interest? I mean, did you grow up in like a real empathic family, and you kind of learned those values from your folks, or, you know, was there, what were the highlights that kind of brought you to this view?
Well, I'm laughing when you talk about growing up with that. My dad was, I talk about my dad a lot when I do trainings, and that how he was like, you know, he grew up in John Wayne, like he didn't stand up behind the boulder with the rifle and say, I don't feel like killing the Indians today. You know, I mean, it was just, my dad was, my dad's great. I just wanted to tell a quick story about, he came to see me, and, you know, I'm like, well, I have to do this training. And on the first day of the training, I said, my dad's going to be here tomorrow. I'll probably be bringing him to Circle and let all the teachers know. And so I brought him along. And, I mean, he is a West River rancher. He is a rough guy. He knew his arm was broke one time because his hand was facing the other way. And he still put the horse out the pasture and unsaddled it before he went to the house. So this is this man.
Tough guy.
And, yeah, tough guy. And he comes to the Circle, and I had never seen fear in his face as I did that day when I handed him a paper plate and a marker. And I said, Dad, I need you to write a relationship value on the plate. And he said, no, you do it. You know, and I'm like, Dad, remember how I told you that I was teaching today and that you had to kind of like role model for everyone that I'm the teacher? So he did it, and the Circle went all the way around. And my dad opened up so much. He got emotional. He really shared some of his life experiences, and it was just all the teachers loved him. They just thought he was great, and we went to lunch, and we're sitting there at Subway, and I was like, Dad, it seemed like you really liked that Circle, or you know, you really shared there. And he just looked down at his sandwich, and he looked at me, and he said, they don't put much meat in these things. So that's my dad, and that's how I grew up. And I don't know if that kind of, that made that, you know, that environment did a little bit differently for my reaching to this, but I don't know. I just, as a social worker, I have a background, was a mental health therapist, and, you know, I worked with violent adolescents, social worker, and I just realized when you find the good inside of people, they can find it themselves too. And believing in people's humanity and responding to that helps them respond to it. So I just fell in love with restorative justice, and I feel so fortunate that what I do for my paycheck is like my purpose for being on the earth. It's just that fulfilling and that important and that human.
Well, looking at your blog and everything that you write, I can really see that passion and enthusiasm really comes through.
Yeah, and it's at the benefit of like all the people that come through our program. Like it's you know, we have a dad that talks about, you know, his daughter was killed by a drunk driver. And he shares that story from the depth of his being and the pain of that. And it's really the kids that he reaches that respond back to him with empathy. And he just said something so brilliant at the end of the Circle, and it was so profound, and we've been kind of trying to remember it. But he talked about if empathy is humanity, then we have humanity here. And if humanity provides us hope, then we also have hope. It was just powerful to put him and his story of pain with people that so related to it and got so connected to him because of that.
Yeah, so it kind of creates, the whole Circle just creates a context, a space where people can share, kind of go deeper, and kind of, it just seems like the whole Circle just facilitates, the very structure facilitates deepening of connection and empathy.
Yeah, it really does, because I think it's part of the way that the Circle goes, kind of like a spiral, that you get deeper into it as you go, because we start out with those values piece, and people still kind of feel awkward, like, you know, I've been called a hippie or kooky, or, you know, that it's touchy-feely, and I just take it that if I get criticized for that, I'm doing it right. Because what happens is we don't change in our comfort zone. So you have to feel a little bit awkward to understand a little bit of change. But then when you hear from someone about what they had for supper, what they'd like to have, you've already heard about what's important to them as a value, and you ease into this discussion, and then pretty soon people are really being vulnerable and sharing. And I just think there's something about vulnerability that's gotten a bad rap. And that sharing, genuine open sharing with another person, is genuinely received by someone else. And it actually creates that kind of connection that is so strong. It just stays with people.
Well, what would a culture of empathy look like if we had a national, international, worldwide culture of empathy? What would that culture look like? It seemed like you were kind of moving towards it, right? It's those feelings of these people connecting. It's kind of like that at a wide scale, maybe.
Yeah, I was part of a week-long training, women's circle retreat, and one of the activities we started with was we faced each other, 2 rows facing each other, and we held hands and we looked into each other's eyes, and then we moved to the next person, and we said to each other, I hope I get this right now. I'm here for you. I can't promise not to hurt you, but if I do, I'll do everything I can to make it right. And so that was a great setup for our training. And it's just so deep to look into someone's eyes and say that, I'm here for you. I can't promise not to hurt you, but if I do, I'll do everything I can to make it right. And to me, a culture of empathy, it's not going to be, perfect or nirvana, but what would happen is that we wouldn't have to resort to violence. We wouldn't have to carry on with the next pain. I think if we had empathy, we wouldn't be harmful to each other, and hurt people will hurt people, and people trying to help others would help. And so I think there'd be a way that we could quickly clean up harms that happen, and that would cause them not to escalate. I also think with empathy, we would start to do things in our community that to me would be like indigenous ways of being, that everyone in our community is important, everyone is valued, everyone in the community needs to make sure that everyone has something to eat. Everyone in this community is important, that everyone deserves to be safe. So that's my, if there was a culture of empathy and we were there, that's what I think it would look like.
Yeah, that was that kind of hit me when you said, I'm there for you. I mean, that's just a beautiful kind of a statement, and to see that at a worldwide level, that we're all there for you. Everyone's there for you, and we're I'm there for you, and you're there for me, and I mean that takes a lot of stress away.
Well, and isn't it so true when you think about it? I mean, why are we here? That gets into a whole other thing, but I'm here for you.
Yeah.
We'll have to get some T-shirts made.
I'm here for you. That's great. Well, what's the obstacles to getting to that world? What is it that is kind of blocking that world, that culture of empathy?
I think it comes down to a little bit of the individual socialization, because I think that what would block me from being there for you would be, well, who's going to take care of me? And if I knew that everybody else was there for me, I wouldn't have to worry about me so much. So I think that kind of collective, that individualized, we all need to have our own cars and our own refrigerators and some of those kind of, I think some of that, I don't know if you would call it industrialized or what it would be, but I think because we haven't felt that everyone is there for me, it causes us to just go, well, I can't be there for others.
Yeah, it's kind of like the social value. It's like, what's the explicit or implicit social value? Like we hear, corporations are there to maximize self-interest and profits. Kind of, and it seems like at a national, international level, that kind of becomes the tone. We're all in it for ourselves. You got to take care of yourself. And so if we hear that message at a national, international, cultural level, I mean, it seems to affect how we act. It's like, you come into an environment, it's like you can feel everybody's in it for themselves. Well, I better be in it for myself too. So I think, that's kind of why I'm kind of doing this culture of empathy, kind of that vision of the term, is that to have a conscious cultural value. Say we consciously affirm this is a national cultural value, somehow.
Yeah, I think we got to get those "I'm here for you" T-shirts. Because Because doesn't that kind of boil it down then? That, I mean, I'm here for you. That's a statement of empathy right there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like, it's that cultural, it's like saying, it's addressing that fear, that overall fear. It's like, hey, I'm here. I'm not buying into that. I'm here for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it ties into the to that vulnerability piece that I think once someone's vulnerable in a circle, it goes to a deeper level. Once someone shares a fear or shares that story of being harmed, it really, and so maybe that I'm here for you really is a vulnerability, and maybe that's why people don't do it. That'll be the front of the shirt. I'm here for you, and then the back will be vulnerability is underrated.
Yeah, there is something about vulnerability that I guess I'm looking in some way that empathy can be. I mean, I know when I'm kind of present with people and I'm well grounded and I've had my empathy battery filled. You know, it's for example, I do kind of like this freestyle dance, and I've been in situations where I've felt very empathized with before I go into it, but then when I have extra energy when I've been empathized with, and I don't have the same fears of vulnerability, for example. So I guess I'm kind of saying that, you know, it's associated with vulnerability as fear, but it's somehow I'm envisioning a space where you can be vulnerable and not be afraid. Something.
Yeah, you need that safety. You need that emotional safety, I think, to be vulnerable without fear. And then I think that knowing people have empathy, that it's grounded in values, or for me, the empathy spaces are circles, and so it's structured. And you know, as long as you have the talking piece, you can share without interruption, without other people talking. And I think that creates that space where that vulnerability can come out, fear-free vulnerability. And then that empathy happens when people do have that element of you really touched me with what you said because you had the courage to open up.
Well, one thing I also like to look at is metaphors. It's a different way of kind of looking at the definition. You know, empathy is often defined as standing in someone else's shoes and looking through someone else's eyes, which is just like, it's just a metaphor. And for me, empathy is like a cornucopia. And it's like a shared cornucopia, because I get to experience, you know, all the richness of the other person, and they get to share it for me, you know. And so I'm wondering, this is kind of like our artistic creativity test here. Do you have like your own personal metaphor? If you can't use one of those, it's already the cultural, you know, used. Do you have like a metaphor? Empathy is like, you know, whatever. Like a type of animal, a type of land, or a machine, or...
What comes to, two things come to mind. The first is that it almost sounds like it's like that reflection, like looking at it, seeing your reflection, like in water or something. But then that reminds me of narcissists. Isn't that how?
No, go with it.
Which empathy would be the opposite of that, but sometimes you can look into a picture, and the glass, you reflect yourself a little bit. So it's sometimes seeing yourself in other people. So maybe that would be a metaphor. The other thing, I read it, and I don't remember where I read it, but I use it when I teach. And I talk about, I say, imagine you and a friend are out in a field, and your friend has one of those model airplanes that they fly around, and they give you the controller, and you fly it around, and your friend says, land it, and you can't do it. You go to the left, it goes to the right, and your friend takes it back and just immediately glides it in. And you ask your friend, well, how did you do that? And your friend says, because I was in the pilot of the plane. I was in the plane. Okay, that's empathy. But what I like, why I like that example is that it's not about going in that other person's shoes. The story that the person's putting themselves into is they and their friend are talking about it. And so I think it helps because you relate to it by the experience happening with your friend as much as I'm in the cockpit of the plane.
So it's kind of like putting yourself, you're putting yourself into the understanding of your friend in, well, it seems to be two levels there. It seems to be you're imagining being in the plane and piloting, so you're kind of imagining being in that situation.
Yep. Yeah, it's like got a dual empathy there, because you could think, oh yeah, that's how you have empathy. You imagine you're in the cockpit of the plane. But somehow I think like telling that story that you and a friend are out in the field, it's like your friend had empathy for you by giving you the answer on how to do it. And your friend had empathy to let you fly the plane. I think it just kind of has a double story.
Yeah, it's kind of like your
message.
mirror one. It's like it's more like a house of mirrors, right? Because you're seeing
Yeah.
yourself and you're seeing the others, and then there's reflections of reflections of reflections, kind of that
Yeah.
quality.
Yeah. You know, and that's a key. The circle has the 4 stages, and that's one of the things we do is we have people reflect on the story that they heard. And that reflection, I talk about that, how you can look at a picture of someone else and see your reflection in the glass, or you can look out a window and you can see what's going on outside, but you see your reflection in it as well. So that's what we build more empathy with people by having that reflection. That reflection part, the talking piece goes around after the story so people can reflect on it. Um, and I think that even builds more empathy because you're relating it to yourself. You're relating to yourself the story that someone else just told.
Well, perhaps we could quickly go through the process of a circle and how you see empathy evolving throughout a circle process. Do we have time for that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I have
Oh,
time
great.
if you have time.
I do. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think, trying to think, should I just run down the circle and
Yeah.
then go back and tell you where
Yeah.
empathy fits in? So we gather people to come into the space, and there's no tables or no chairs. So sometimes that alone in itself, sitting like that, makes people a little more vulnerable, or it's different than usually coming to a class session or something you're court ordered to do. Because in court there were, the judge was up there, and so I think that we set up that kind of space. We have an opening reading, and that's usually a poem or a story that sets people into the space. Usually something kind of motivational, or maybe in the story there was an aha moment by someone. Then we do the values, where we ask people to think of someone that they have a close relationship with, and then write that word on the plate. And we go around and we write it on a paper plate. We put those in the center. And then we use consensus, where we pass the talking piece around, and does everyone agree that you have room for what everyone else has here, that you will honor the values for the time that we're in circle. I explain that restorative justice isn't just a 2-hour circle or 1-hour seminar, but it's a way of life, of living in good relationship with people. And if these values are good for our relationships outside of circle, then they'll be good for our circle here together while we're together. So people go around, and everyone, I'm in, I commit, I'm good, or they'll say I'll try, or I might have a little hard time with this one. So we know how we're going to relate to each other, and that's the getting acquainted stage. The next one is the building relationship stage, and that's where we're going to talk a little bit more about a story. And questions might be those icebreaker types, what you have for breakfast, or if you drive any kind of car, visit any country, where would you go? But a building relationship question, it's more like a few sentences. Are you still there?
Yeah. It was just breaking up a little bit. Are you?
Oh.
If you stop
Okay.
and start your video, sometimes that helps kind of
All right.
reestablish the connection.
How's that?
Good so far.
Okay. So the getting acquainted stage is where we talk about, because you're not the worst thing that ever happened to you or the worst thing that you ever did. We're more than that as people. So that's why we do getting acquainted. And then we do the addressing issue round in circle, and that's we're talking about the harm that happened or the conflict. And then the final phase of the circle is taking action. And so where I see empathy coming in is basing it on values at the beginning, placing people in a space where you completely see each other. When you see more of a person, I think you have an opportunity for more empathy. I think in the getting acquainted, the empathy almost sometimes is like we're all in this together. We've all, agreed to honor these values. The getting acquainted and building relationship questions, where people are talking a little bit more about themselves, that's where I think empathy comes in, because you're knowing a little more about the person's story. And the more that you know about someone, the less likely you are to behave harmful to them, the more you have a connection. And then the addressing issue stage, where empathy comes in, is the person is telling their story. The space has been set up, and that's where the empathy comes in, like we were talking about the case where people had empathy for the kids because it's kind of fun to blow stuff up. They had empathy for the police officer because they were telling their story. So that's how empathy is in the addressing issue stage. The final stage of circle is taking action, and that's, what am I taking away from the circle? How am I a better person for my interactions with you? And that's where I think people are actually verbalizing their empathy for others and knowing how they're going to go out into the world really as better people because of what they've learned from each other.
Well, the definition I have of empathy, I see empathy as 4 parts to it. Self-empathy, which is mindfulness, self-awareness, sensory awareness. Mirrored empathy, part 2, which is through mirror neurons, where we kind of reflect what's going on in each other. And then there's a 3rd part, which is imaginative empathy, which is also called cognitive empathy, or it's kind of perspective taking, be able to take the perspective of someone, which is a little bit more of a cognitive, imaginative part. And then the 4th part is empathic action. And the empathic action is something that I think is not addressed very much, and I see it in restorative circles and mediation, is that when people have kind of created that empathic connection, they've started to see each other and feel each other and know how the perspective of the other, that then when they work together to create some kind of a plan to go forward, and when that plan happens, and when there's that sense of connection that we're working together on this plan, that itself, that is like empathic action, where the blocks to the action are removed.
Boy, that is so beautiful. That just fits perfectly. And what I see, that last part of the empathic action, restorative justice research has shown that people who go through a restorative process are more likely to do the elements in their agreement than they are if the courts order the same elements. So you might, obviously, restitution, community service, plant apple seeds because you cut down somebody else's apple tree. But why do they do it more in restorative justice than if it's court ordered? I think it's because this empathic action is right in there. That's really beautiful. We should work on an article together.
That'd be great. I like doing video, so working with someone that does writing, that takes the burden. For me, it's a little bit of a burden to write, so I'd love to write that up, work together on that.
Yeah, I'd like to do more. I'd like to do some. One of the things to mastering a skill, becoming an expert, is 10,000 hours of doing it, but then you also need feedback. And so I want to help people, like, let's have a way to do video conferencing about, circle consultation. Because what I found is some people, they call it restorative justice because it's not retributive, but it doesn't necessarily mean it really is that. It's gotten a term that's gotten a little kind of squashed, or people aren't always, I'm a little dogmatic about my restorative justice. Mm-hmm. So have empathy with me for that one.
Yeah, you're saying you'd like to do, well, I'm looking at how we go forward too, so this is a bit, maybe we're dialoguing here about our empathic action between you and I, and we're saying, okay, well, this is empathic action in process, right? We're talking about how we're going to work together. And we both I see you really value empathy. You've really got a good sense of empathy, and you're wanting to promote empathy, and that's for myself. So we're kind of seeing each other. We've learned a little bit about each other, and now we want to work together to take some kind of action. And we're kind of doing this back and forth negotiation that kind of happens within restorative justice and mediation itself.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. I see on my clock here, it's been 1 hour and 4 minutes. And I saw some of your other interviews, and I'm like, well, there's no way. How are we possibly going to go that long? It's been great. But no, I really, you're right. That empathic action that's exactly it. And I really appreciate, I'll have to do a blog on this, appreciate you asking me where in my process do I see empathy, because that's going to allow me to be even more intentional about bringing it into the process and into my circles.
Well, we can bring
I
this.
probably got about a dozen blog posts out of this conversation.
Oh yeah, and we can have more dialogues, because I love this Skype, because it's so easy to set these up and record them and put them online, and you know, doing kind of a group. We can do group calls as well with, you know, up to 10 people in a call. So.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. We'll definitely yeah, continue the collaboration for sure.
Well, to kind of bring this call to a close, I mean, I can go on for hours on this topic, but do you have any final thoughts that, you know, anything that we should cover to kind of be complete?
I just really want to thank you. I just appreciate every time I've done something like this where I've networked with someone to talk about it. It's been such a value added. So I really, really appreciate you connecting with me and allowing me the opportunity to focus on a discussion with that. And I just feel so action orientated to what we can do, especially those T-shirts.
The T-shirts, go T-shirts! I've got, yeah, I can't wait to see that, and then I can say, yeah, I helped inspire those T-shirts.
Yeah.
Well, okay, well, great. Well, I'll stop the recording here.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.